Hi everybody and welcome to another piano video here on the Merriam Pianos YouTube channel. We are continuing our series into looking at different piano producing countries around the world, and today's is all about Japan. Hard to think of a country that has had a greater influence on 20th century piano ownership and buying and playing than Japan. Of course, within Japan, we are talking about Kawai and Yamaha almost exclusively. So we're going to be talking about the country and how pianos came to be and the role that those two companies have played in its growth as a global dominant piano producing region. If it's the first time that you are joining us here on the channel, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe and notification bell because we'd love for you to join our community, come learn a little bit more about pianos, both at a very high level and right down into individual product reviews. So without further delay, let's get started today with a look at Japan's piano industry. So the next country we're going to explore is Japan. No discussion about the modern piano industry would be complete without a thorough exploration of exactly how the piano came to be such a popular cultural phenomenon in Japan, and then how that manufacturing industry went on to really dominate and completely revolutionize the modern piano industry as a whole. Everybody, I think at this point, certainly those watching this video, is probably aware that the modern Japanese piano industry is dominated by two names, Yamaha and Kawai. But to go back to the origins of piano in Japan, really the origins of European music popularity in Japan, you have to go back to an era in the late 1800s or mid to late 1800s called the Meiji era. And this was a time in which Japan was undergoing some major internal cultural revolution and modernization. And to understand what was happening inside Japan at that time, you really need to understand what was happening in many other Asian countries, underdeveloped Asian countries, or even African countries. And we were in a period really known as kind of the second period of imperial colonization. And this was where you had many of the European powers that had previously been participating in colonization through starting really halfway through the second millennia, 1500s and beyond. And they had restarted colonization efforts or imperial activity fueled by the Industrial Revolution. And this was a time where a lot of the European powers were seeing well into the future and understanding that the control of resources, the control of major geographical zones of the world was going to really position countries between the haves and have-not. And so there was this rush by many nations to go into a lot of these areas and take them over. If not politically, then certainly economically. And you see that happen extensively in Africa. You saw that happen quite a bit in Laos, Cambodia. It was happening certainly throughout a number of the other kind of Southeast Asian countries. Malaysia, which wasn't even called exactly Malaysia at that time, Burma, which is now modern Myanmar. India was more of a slow creep, but again, that was more of an economic takeover by British interests that kind of turned into a semi-political takeover. So all of this was happening, and Japan, rather than sit on their hands and wait for this to occur, there was a very intentional movement to quickly modernize the country, update its political structures, update its economic policies, and almost try and mimic or mirror themselves as a European power as a way to deflect any incoming European colonization efforts. So you had the political leadership of Japan start to institute a number of educational reforms and social reforms and cultural reforms, and there was this quite, I don't know if forced is the right word, but there was a deliberate importation of European culture and dissemination throughout the country. At this time, piano playing in Europe was considered a very elite pastime. It was a sign of social mobility. A lot of upper middle class homes had pianos, and for whatever reason, an unmarried woman's ability to play the piano was considered a mark of how worthy they were of being wife material. And so all of that got imported really into Japan. And it wasn't really as forced as sometimes it is portrayed. In a lot of the reading I was doing, there was as much an embrace of this as it was any sort of a forced assimilation or a forced acceptance. Pianos and European music really flooded in as a result of this. Now we need to remember that in the late 1800s, if you wanted to experience European music and you weren't going to go to the symphony, there were no phonographs, there obviously was no other method of playing back music other than to recreate it on an instrument. And there is no instrument better suited to recreate Western music than the piano. In fact, that's a completely reciprocal kind of concept anyway, because the piano was what resulted in a lot of Western musical conception. Compositionally, texturally, it had a very, very heavy influence on a lot of writing styles of Western composers right up through the 1800s. So as Japan is going through this internal revolution, or certainly evolution, their industry begins to explore the manufacture of a lot of these European-influenced or European-derived instruments. That included organ, and it went on to include pianos. This is where the folklore of Yamaha and Kawai kind of come into the picture. Yamaha started in 1887 as an organ company and was a relatively small producer of those instruments at that time. Yamaha doesn't tend to elaborate a lot on that early part of their history. If you read it from Yamaha's perspective, or look through Wikipedia articles, or even through some of Yamaha's corporate releases, such as their annual shareholder report or anything like that, they are a little light on details what happens really between the 1887 up to about post World War II. From Kawai's telling, this is where Koichi Kawai, who was the founder of Kawai eventually, came to be employed by the Yamaha company and was a very influential and instrumental engineer in the early development of their piano business. In fact, Koichi Kawai was the holder of the very first patent for the Japanese manufactured and designed piano action. So Koichi Kawai, it's very difficult to know whether he was leading the division or whether he was simply part of a team of engineers that were responsible for this, but certainly what does seem clear is that he was an instrumental component of the early Yamaha piano program. The decision was made in 1927. Koichi Kawai left Yamaha. That was around the time that Yamaha went from family ownership and control and converted themselves into a public company. Of course, in the late 1920s, largely influenced by the United States, IPOs and companies going public was very in vogue. So Kawai started up their company in the same city that Yamaha was operating, which was Hamamatsu, and those are still the locations, or the location where both of those companies call their headquarters to this day. Kawai and Yamaha both experienced a moderate level of growth and success producing pianos and increasing their popularity throughout Japan, leading up to World War II. Now, World War II was a brutal time for both companies. Kawai lost all of their manufacturing capacity. Yamaha lost all factories save one. Following the war, Yamaha had a bit of a head start. They were able to get production going several years before Kawai was able to get restarted, and really focused on efficient output and production. Kawai stayed in a slightly smaller scale for several more years than Yamaha did. So Yamaha really raced into the 1950s and further into the 1960s as the dominant player in the Japanese piano world. And by the late 1960s was actually the largest piano manufacturer in the world. They were focused on building modern factories. They were focused on really bringing in a lot of German design and German innovation. They hired several consultants through that time to come in and improve the instruments. And they focused on artist endorsement and public placement of the instruments very, very early on in Western nations and North American nations, and really cemented their place in a lot of people's minds as being the new innovators of the industry coming up through the 60s and 70s. Around that time, the United States was experiencing just a total collapse of their industry. They'd already gone through a major collapse in the 1930s, but this one was brought on as much by their own lack of innovation as just lack of focus and general waning of demand in the late 1970s again in the United States. And you really at that point only had a few companies producing instruments. The Aeolian Company owned many of the brands that most people were seeing in stores. You still had Steinway, Mason and Hamlin at that point, I believe might have still been with Aeolian. Charles Walter was just a small producer. It was really a shell of its former self in terms of the national industry. And the product wasn't very good. With a few exceptions. Of course, Steinway was still producing world-class instruments out of New York, but in terms of the mid-range, in terms of what Yamaha and Kawai were themselves producing at a very high level in Japan, the United States just did not measure up. And Yamaha focused far before Kawai did on export into the United States and building up a sales team and a sales force and a dealer network to bring those instruments in. And when they arrived, they absolutely obliterated the locally produced content and spelled doom for the little shreds of what the industry was at that point. Even that just kind of folded and collapsed to the point where we really just have 2 or 3 manufacturers left in North America. The Yamaha product coming in was better. It was more consistent. Following a period where they were still kind of figuring out the wood conditioning, they got that sorted out in 5 or 6 years, and the product was stable. And this permitted schools and churches and homes and everything to really get very high quality product in there for a fraction of the price of what it would have cost them to purchase a similar quality instrument purchased in Europe or the United States. This created a completely new standard for what a mid-range piano was capable of, and it helped push standards for existing European manufacturers higher, and it allowed for a very high quality of music making and notably a very, very high standard and consistency in music education to occur. So we then had hundreds of thousands of Japanese pianos being sold every decade coming into the United States. As I said, first primarily by Yamaha. Kawai quickly picked up steam. Yamaha really maintained a clearly dominant position both in terms of sales and I think for a lot of people, with a few exceptions to specific models, quality and musical innovation as well, right up until the point where Kawai invested and created their Royo piano factory, which is just kind of on the outskirts of Hamamatsu. And this was the first time where their production capacity as well as the quality and the research division of Kawai truly rivaled what Yamaha had been giving to the industry for, say, the last 20 years at that point. And so because of the capacities that that factory and that total facility, the research facility provided, we then started getting products such as the RX line of grand pianos, the first version of the K series, uprights out of Kawai. Those, of course, evolved into the GX and the K series that we have today, still in 2022. Both Yamaha and Kawai continue to produce a very large number of instruments in Japan by Japanese labor, and both are still quite vertically integrated. They do not have lots of external suppliers. They create their own actions. They dry and season and cut their own wood. They cast their own plates. They create and build their own strings. It's pretty much all created and built by those companies, the pianos and their components that you are getting today. And really for about the last 20 years, every publication that you could get your hands on, from Larry Fine to his current iteration of the Piano Buyer Guide, Blue Book of Pianos, Piano World, any kind of third-party resource that observes and comments on the piano industry, have placed Kawai and Yamaha at equal quality levels, equal musical reputational levels, and you really now do have, from a musical standpoint, I think a lot of people would consider a battle of equals, which is not to say that it's the battle of the sames. You still have a very different tonal philosophy coming from Yamaha versus Kawai. You still have a very different marketing philosophy coming out of those two instruments. Kawai generally tends to rely a lot on its dealers to produce a lot of the material and commentary on the brand, whereas Yamaha takes a much more top-down approach, and there's a lot of corporate material that comes out from Yamaha. Yamaha tends to be still focused, as it was right from its earliest days, on a lot of endorsement and public placement. Kawai hasn't gone down that road. So two companies that certainly operate very differently, but in terms of size, have pulled quite close, a lot closer than I think a lot of people realize. For their Japanese output of both uprights and grands, you've got Yamaha producing to Kawai in about a 4-to-3 ratio, which is certainly a lot narrower than it has been at any other time in history. And as I said, you've got these two companies that are putting out products that really have achieved very similar levels of reputation and quality. So the two companies currently produce pianos not just in Japan but also in Indonesia. But their Japanese lineup from the two companies currently consists of the GC Grand Series from Yamaha. That contrasts approximately with the GL series from Kawai. You've got the GX series from Kawai that is, contrasts approximately with the Yamaha CX. Kawai has their upper end handmade instruments called the Shigeru Kawai. The equivalent on the Yamaha side would be their CF series. And kind of sandwiched between their CX and CF is an SX series, which is essentially a factory-built version of their CF series. Kawai has kind of bridged that gap between the GX and the Shigeru, GX being essentially a factory-built version of the Shigeru. So, you never find exact matches when you're comparing two companies and their lineups, but that approximately is what is available out of the two companies for the grand pianos. For upright pianos, Yamaha makes their U series and their YUS series, which is their higher end premium uprights. On the Kawai side, their K series from the K300 and up is the Japanese, what is available out of Japan for upright pianos. So what are the characteristics of a Japanese piano? What makes a Japanese piano other than the tag on the back that says made in Japan? Well, because the industry is so consolidated into just two companies, it kind of boils down into a conversation of what does a Yamaha play like and what does a Kawai play like? Are there commonalities between those two pianos that you could say is indicative of a Japanese piano as a whole versus Yamaha or Kawai? Yamaha tends to have a really clear sound, which is a little biased towards the mid and the upper range. The bass is very nice and clear, but tends to be not as bloomy or not as warm, I guess some people might use as a description, is what you get on the Kawai. The Kawai tends to be a little more V-like in its tone. So you have typically on a Kawai quite a present bass, quite a warm bass. The mid-range on Kawais are very, very colorful, and the top end tends to be quite strong. One big difference between them, non-tonally speaking, is the action, and this is something that emerged really in the 1970s. Both companies actually experimented with the addition of ABS to their action. I think there's a popular misconception that ABS was a material that was exclusively pioneered by Kawai or instituted by Kawai. Yamaha was using ABS for their jacks in a number of actions through the 70s, 80s, 90s. I believe there are still some models being sold today that may still use some ABS components in the action. It made a lot of sense for companies to be experimenting with this because wood as an action material is pretty imperfect unless you are going to dry the wood for an obscenely long time and really work with it and regulate it over an extended period of time, which for Japanese pianos, because of the price point, oftentimes wasn't practical. So getting into some of these synthetic materials made a lot of sense. Now, Kawai really took it on the chin. They not only did they pioneer a much more extensive use of this, but they really ran with it as a major selling point of the instrument. I don't think they were quite prepared for the backlash that occurred. There were a lot of dealerships that just used this as a punching bag. They added or infused that ABS with carbon fiber to produce their Millennium 3 action. And I think because of sort of this constant evolution of that action combined with the fact that the actions had been in the field for 30, 40 years, I think there's generally a consensus among the technician community, or at least certainly if we're to use pianobuyer.com as a nice neutral reference point, I think Larry Fine's quote is that this is essentially a settled issue, and that everybody who's seen these actions out in the field from a technical standpoint consider them to be as or more stable and reliable than a wood action, and at the very least really consider this a choice of different but equal action qualities. So a couple of inflection points along the way in which Kawai and Yamaha have differed in their approach, but ultimately what we have in 2022 are extremely reliable instruments, instruments that present a different tonal quality, instruments that both seem to, in virtually every market they're sold to, retain an incredibly strong resale value. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Japanese piano industry, the very, very short, concise history of what's happened with that, that instrument and the industry that produces it within Japan. If you ever have a chance to actually visit one or both of those companies' factories in Japan, it's really fascinating. I've had a chance to visit the Kawai factory twice now. There is such a high level of pride, and there's such a high level of manual involvement despite the level of automation. Thank you so much for watching. It is the first time you are seeing us here on the channel. We'd really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button and notification bell. We'd love for you to come back, check more videos out, and of course check more of these videos on different piano producing regions of the world out. You might learn something, who knows. My name is Stu Harrison. This has been Merriam Pianos on YouTube, and we'll see you again soon.